Testing, testing. How's it going, folks? And welcome to this week's mini lecture on the telenovela in Latin America. Of course, the other themes covered as well in this module is also theater and literature. But here for this mini lecture, I'll be focusing primarily on television, specifically on the telenovela. And here I will be covering Ana M. Lopez's work, our welcome guest, Telenovelas in Latin America. So even if this is not the choice reading that you selected or were assigned, regardless, it will be touching on some of these themes that we're looking at with relation to theater and popular media in general. And with that, let's get into it. But before even going into our mini lecture, I thought it was important to kind of cover what distinguishes a telenovela from a soap opera, because there's often when you're asked by folks to describe what exactly is a novela or a telenovela, many folks will often sort of just say, well, it's basically the Spanish language version of a soap opera. And I mean, there's some truth to that, but we also have to keep in mind that there are some very key distinguishing characteristics, and there's some similarities, of course. This is not a point mentioned in Ana Lopez's article, but I thought I would mention it here as to not ignore it, which is, of course, and I think this is something that folks talk about often when it comes to the subject of telenovelas. There's been a lot of literature on this subject, is how telenovelas tend to sort of be used as a tool to describe women's virtues, right? As a way to kind of transmit women's virtues, to encourage women to behave in a feminine manner that is receptive to patriarchy, right? So it often is used as a vehicle to teach women how to be model mothers. But granted, right, we can argue that the modern telenovela today, many of these novellas today that have been produced challenge, right, this view of the woman having to sort of be someone who stays at the home and who puts up with male patriarchal violence and authority. And you do see that there are many telenovelas today that are sort of challenging these stereotypical views. But again, I digress. That's a subject for a different time. But what distinguishes a telenovela from a soap opera? So, for starters, the telenovela, in contrast to the US soap opera, they tend to have clear cut stories. So, they do have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They don't sort of go on and on and on, right? Whereas US soap operas, they usually go on for hundreds of episodes with no clear end. And granted, it's not to say that they don't end, but at least the Latin American telenovelas do have an ending point. There's usually that definitive final episode. Um, Also, in terms of funding, the Latin American telenovela tends to get their funding directly from the television networks, whereas the soap opera companies traditionally had been the ones to fund US soap operas, right? And of course, this still tends to be the case today, right? Where you have soap companies that are still funding these. And granted, you also have the smaller companies or those companies that are allowed their commercials to run. They're also, of course, funding those programs directly. So and granted, today you have some changes with that structure, but generally speaking, television networks, Latin American television networks, tend to be the ones that fund the telenovela. Another key major difference with the Latin American telenovela, in contrast to the soap opera, is that for someone to be an actor in a soap opera, and excuse me, in a novela, it's considered to be, if you're an actor in a telenovela, it's considered that you have reached the apex of your professional career. Whereas in the United States, if you're in the soap opera industry, if you're an actor in a soap opera, you're kind of considered second rate. They often refer to it as slumming, as mentioned in the article. And it's also, in contrast to the US soap opera, what we also see is that not only do the folks who are constantly featured in the novelas as actors, we see them emerge as recurring actors and stars in other telenovelas. And so, as an example here, I have Thalia. You probably might, for those of y'all who are Gen Z and probably are not familiar with the Latin American telenovela. Thalia, right? Maybe you might have heard of her. She's done a couple of songs with artists like Fat Joe and others here in the United States. And although she might be known here in the United States more for her singing career, she does have a very long history as a telenovela actor. She's perhaps one of her most famous roles was in Maria la del Barrio and Marimar. And so and and it's because of the fact that these telenovelas, right, that they have a beginning, middle, and end. It's thanks to that structure that she was able to be a telenovela star and many other roles. And lastly, what has distinguished the Latin American telenovela from the soap opera is that what we see happening in the 1970s and 80s is that they become so popular that they're able to be exported elsewhere to either other Latin American nations. But in some cases, we see that some of these telenovelas become so popular that they're even exported to Europe. They become exported, especially to Spain. There's markets for them even in Asia and also in parts of Africa as well, right? Where they're, of course, dubbed in other languages. But perhaps one of the most important markets for the Latin American telenovela is definitely the US market. And one of the other factors that has allowed the Latin American telenovela to become so popular, or what makes it so distinct and in some ways similar to the US soap opera, is how they hinge so much on using melodrama to tell their stories. So being overtly dramatic, right, to tell their stories. And perhaps for those of you who are on the internet a lot and are familiar somewhat with the world of telenovelas, have probably been exposed to this scene from Maria la del Barrio that features the actress Itati Cantoral, engaged in one of the most famous freakouts, right, in telenovela history, where she depicts the villain Soraya Montenegro angry at this child that she's supposed to be taking care of, who she refers to, and apologies, this is using ableist language here and offensive language, but refers to the child that she's referring to, who is wheelchair bound as a cripple, right? Essentially as a godforsaken cripple, or as la maldita lisiada. And she's angry that and just to kind of give you a sense of how dramatic some of these telenovelas are, right? In this scene of the telenovela, she has been trying to seduce the son of her enemy, right? Her enemy in this case being Talia or Maria la del Barrio. She's trying to seduce her son. And I'm forgetting what the plot of this was. It was many years ago that I last saw this. But anyway, she catches him being intimate, right? Or giving a kiss, excuse me, in this case, to the child that she's taking over. So she's taking care of, excuse me. So I'll just let this scene speak for itself. I'm not going to show the whole thing. And I have the link on there for those of you all who want to take a look. Actually, I don't think I could play this. Never mind. It doesn't look like it's letting me play the clip. So you're just going to have to watch it on YouTube if you want to see. And viewer discretion advised. Okay. And before I continue on with this lecture, also, I wanted to briefly touch on, so what are some of these characteristics that make these telenovelas so popular, right? Going back to our theme of Latin American popular culture. Well, we have to also think about what is it that make the telenovelas so distinct. And so generally when we're talking about the telenovela, we often talk about, there's two key sort of trajectories, right? You have the Mexican tradition and you have the Brazilian tradition of telenovelas, and unfortunately, right, not to sort of say that those are the only two standards, right? But usually, when other Latin American nations are making their telenovelas, traditionally, at least back in the 70s and 80s, they followed either the traditional Mexican model of telenovelas or the Brazilian model. And so, what exactly made these distinct, right? So the Mexican telenovela was distinct in the fact that it was that the Mexican telenovela tended to be known for being very melodramatic, right? It was known for weepiness of the characters. Um, I mean, it's perhaps no surprise, right, that the meme for cries in Spanish, right, features Itati Cantoral from Mariela del Barrio, right, crying in Spanish, just kind of as a funny allusion there. Um, but what also makes the Mexican telenovela distinct is that they tend to not make references to specific historical moments or specific historical events. In contrast, the Brazilian telenovela does tend to nod to specific historical events. And unlike the sort of melodrama that you see, the overdramaticism that you see in the Mexican telenovela, the Brazilian telenovela tends to aim for more realism. So more realistic quality in the acting versus the sort of over the top melodrama that you see in the Mexican telenovela. And then another important quality that has made these telenovelas so marketable is the way that they're able to quote sell themselves or sell this view of the nation. Um, to other countries as well as to their viewers as well. So, in other words, what are some of the ways that the novelas how are they able to market themselves nationally to folks within the nation, as well as to other Latin American nations, and eventually how are they able to expand to markets outside of the nation, right? So again, keeping in mind that this is a time where the key creators of the telenovela at this time in the 80s and 70s were Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and as well as, excuse me, excuse me, I had to go back to look at my notes real fast. But the key creators of telenovelas at this time were Cuba, Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil, and Peru, keeping that in mind. And so eventually, what were some of the factors or lessons learned for them to market themselves nationally and internationally? So one thing we learned is that many of these nations who were producing telenovelas, one of the ways that they were able to sort of market their telenovelas to other nations that had similar histories as them is, well, when the plot line touched on similar historical events or historical events that they could relate to. You have, for example, in the case of Brazil, right? Their telenovelas that focused on instances of slavery in Latin America, right? That was something that was receptive, right, to the Caribbean markets. And we kind of see this still here today, right? That's why I have some of these examples that are mentioned here. So, for example, the Mexican telenovela La Rosa de Guadalupe, or the Rose of the Virgin Mary of Guadalupe, although it focuses on events in Mexico, many of the social concerns that are described in the novela, such as drug use, things related to uh, youth engaging in drugs. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of this telenovela because for those of you familiar, you know that it has some very ridiculous episodes. Um, the fact of the matter is that many of these themes, right, they're of concern to conservative Latin American audiences, especially those who are very Catholic. Um, Another thing that we see is that one of the ways that they sort of market this notion of Latin America as a modern nation is that they depict many of these characters engaging in international travel, right? Whether it's to Paris, to Miami, and other places, right? So if they're not if their novela doesn't claim to be taking place in a specific part of Latin America, one of the things they'll do is, of course, at least show the characters traveling to specific places, at least to kind of give a nod to the viewer, like, "Hey, I've been there before," or "Oh, it would be awesome to go there." And for Latin American audiences, right, it also kind of allows them sort of that escape, right, so that perceived escape from their local settings. And lastly, one of the ways in which they are able to make the telenovela marketable to places outside of their nation is by making the novela not nation specific, right? So, for in other words, they'll you have some telenovelas, for example, that take place in some ambiguous Caribbean island, but they never name which island it is, or it'll be somewhere. The novela will take place somewhere, presumably in Latin America, but you can't tell. It's not clear if it's in Mexico. Is it in Colombia? Is this somewhere in Argentina, for example? But this is sometimes it's never revealed within the telenovela. And I have here also sort of this also another example where sometimes you have some novelas that take place in many nations. So, for example, in the case of Mujer or Woman, Casos de la Vida Real or Real Life Cases, which is a very depressing show, I must say. It takes place, most of the cases take place in Mexico, but sometimes they do feature cases, real life cases, right? These are novelas that are inspired by real life events, and they're very depressing, I should say. Um, and so this show will sometimes feature places in the United States, sometimes parts of South America and Central America as well. Um, and so, sort of this allure, right, is what also encourages viewers outside of the place where the novela was produced. Next, I want to turn into one of the other themes that is discussed in this article, which is inventing nation. And so, in other words, how do these telenovelas work together to not work together, I should say, but how do these telenovelas create this image of the nation? And more specifically, how are they catering to these more international audiences, specifically those audiences, especially in the United States? And so one of the questions I have here is, how did Univision and Telemundo begin to cater to US and Latin American audiences? Well, for starters, we start to see that going into the 90s and late 80s, many of these novelas started to create, well, not only were there novelas that were created in the United States, but they also included telenovela actors as well as telenovela characters who reflected, right, the diverse Latina population in the US, right? So you had some of these novelas that featured migrants who were from Cuba, who were from Puerto Rico, who were from Mexico. For example, Telemundo had produced the first telenovela in the United States, and that was Angelica Mi Vida, or Angelica My Love. And it featured Puerto Rican, Mexican, and Cuban immigrants as characters, among other telenovelas produced in the 90s that featured this multicultural cast was El Magnate, and also Maria Elena in 1992. And we see that Televisa, which at that time was sort of loosely associated with Univision, they produced perhaps one of the most famous, right, telenovelas that was produced in the United States, which was Dos Mujeres Un Camino, or Two Women and One Road, as well as another lesser known telenovela, which was Valentina. And we see that what's interesting about the case of Dos Mujeres Un Camino is that it features this sort of borderland setting, and in this sense, we see that it's trying to cater to not only audiences in Mexico and Greater Latin America per se, one could argue, but also catering to audiences in the United States, right? Because again, this takes place in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, vaguely, right? Although the main character, Eric Estrada, he's was actually from Puerto Rico. He plays, right, this truck driver in Los Angeles, who's married to a famous Mexican actor, Laura Leon, right, who plays the character of Ana Maria. And just as a side note, Laura Leon, right, she is sort of this veteran actress, right, and also a singer who's credited with creating the theme song for this for Dos Mujeres Un Camino. Uh, and um, and what's interesting about that novela, about Dos Mujeres Un Camino, again, that's another one that I haven't seen since I was a child, but it blurs this view of the border, right? It's There's moments where you can't tell which parts of the novela are actually taking place on the U.S. and which parts are supposed to be taking place in Mexico. So it's interesting, right, how it sort of blurs those boundaries, right? It kind of creates the sense of familiarity for the Latin American audience, right? Um, Another interesting point that's raised here, right, is how it sort of tries to appeal to the U.S. borderlands audience. Is that the character of Eric Estrada, right, is meant to be sort of relatable, especially for those U.S. Latin Americans who uh, who have trouble speaking Spanish, right? I mean, myself included, right? It sort of appeals to the so-called pocho audiences, right? Which pocho, again, being a somewhat derogatory term referring to people who don't speak Spanish that well. And we learned this because Eric Estrada, right? He actually took a crash course on Spanish in order to play this role. And it's evident as you're watching the telenovela, right? That as you get the sense that he struggles to speak Spanish, or that his Spanish is very fuzzy, right? Or he speaks Spanish with a very markedly English accent, right? With an English accent, excuse me. Well, with the you could tell that he did not, you know what I'm trying to say, that he essentially speaks Spanish, right, as someone who was born in the United States would speak Spanish that is of Latino descent. um, but it sort of adds to the charm, right, to the telenovela, and what makes him also relatable, right, for US Latinos who are watching this novela. And for those who are kind of exotify, right? Those in Mexico or in other parts of Latin America who exotify, right? The attractive Latino, right? Who has the accent, right? It's also something that's reflected in this novela. And lastly, another thing that we see that were were these telenovelas, what's making them so marketable on both sides of the border, one would argue, is the inclusion of US and Latin American celebrities, right? So we've talked about Eric Estrada. Laura Leon was somebody who was definitely famous on both sides of the border. Perhaps infamously, right, you have someone who's known more internationally, like Celia Cruz, right, who was featured in the telenovela Valentina. And so, unfortunately, that telenovela did not do as well as Dos Mujeres Un Camino. But we see that Celia Cruz is included here also as the sort of this key celebrity figure. And not only was she a celebrity that was featured in this show particularly, we learned that Telemundo actually Univision included her in their many talk shows, including the one hosted by Cristina Saralegui. And I say that very amicably because Cristina is someone who my family grew up watching for many years. And among other celebrities, this also included musicians. You have folks like Bronco, right, who are famous in the U.S. As well as in Mexico, that were also featured in this novela. And so this is a tradition, I would argue, that has continued into the present. And so, what are some conclusions as to what we can say about how telenovelas, what is it that made them so popular, or why do we include them within the sort of the emblematic? It's sort of when we're thinking about Latin American popular culture, I feel that novelas is something that you cannot forget. So, what are some of the factors that have made them so popular? What has contributed to their popularity? Well, for starters, many of these telenovelas, we see that they have evolved with the times. They've become very much hyper aware of their Spanish speaking market. They're very much aware that their market does not just include people in Latin America, but also folks in the United States. And even beyond that, right, we learned that many of these telenovelas, as they're evolving, they're even being exported to other nations, right, outside of the US and Latin America. Um, and For example, the telenovela Maria la del Barrio, right, also received a Filipino adaptation, right, as well. Um, and so Maria la del Barrio, right, there's also a Filipina counterpart as well. Um, and some of these other telenovelas, right, have also and television shows that might be based in Asia or in the U.S. or in other parts of Europe have received Latin American adaptations as well. Um, we also see, for example, in the case of Betty La Fea, she's been actually given a U.S. adaptation as Ugly Betty, right? And there's actually this famous episode where both Betty La Fea, the Latin American version, meets with Betty La Fea, right, the U.S. version. Um, we also see that many of these telenovelas, of course, are evolving with the times in terms of picking up on themes that are often spoken of in the media, such as the subject of drug cartels. We see that with the famous novela La Reina del Sur becoming so popular. And this would actually not be the last, right? There are many other narco novelas that have also emerged since then. The last point that's mentioned here is that the Latin American telenovela, is one thing that's undergoing constant transformation, and it reflects many of these sort of imagined communities at the time. Um, what I mean by that is, so I include here, for example, Jane the Virgin. I know this is kind of a controversial inclusion here, but in many ways, right, you have academics who have studied it as a sort of a modern version or a modern take on the novella, and it reflects many of these sort of changing dynamics, right, where it's sort of a novella that outrightly changes the patriarchal storyline that we often see in telenovelas. It also includes Venezuelan migrants, right, as opposed to Mexican migrants coming to the US, and specifically in this case, to Miami. And lastly, thinking about how these telenovelas have evolved over time, right? You have many of these novelas that are undergoing reboots, such as the famous La Usurpadora, or the Usurper, where sort of the role of the main character has now went from being this sort of this rich woman living in an ambiguously rich neighborhood, now being sort of affiliated with the wife of the president of Mexico in this case. And so this is something that's interesting, right? Because we see that the telenovela itself, it's undergoing this transformation now, where it's sort of now picking up on these women leads who are in some cases, right, challenging the patriarchal power structures that have or sort of they're challenging the traditionally passive role that they've taken in many of the novelas, right, as the sort of ideal wife, right? So these women are in many cases are depicted as challenging gender stereotypes. And what that change looks like in the next from now until the coming years is something that's yet to be seen. So that's it for now, and I will see you all in the next lecture. Thank you.